In this section, we are going to create some buttons. Specifically, we are going to create this app here. We have the normal button, this one we have already seen. Then we have checkbox buttons and we have radio buttons. How they work in detail, I'll explain while I make this section. But these are the main buttons we are going to work with. So, there are three major kinds of button. We have a button, a check button, and a radio button. And a really important thing here is that to use them properly, you are going to need tkinter variables. The stuff I have covered in the last section. But, well, let's jump right in and let's have a look. Here I have a new Python file, and I already have some imports, and I'm creating the basic window. The last thing I need is I have to run the entire thing, and this I do with window.main loop. Which means if I run the entire thing now, we can see we have a basic window. I do want to make two minor changes. First of all, I want to create a title, and I call this one just buttons. Besides that, I also want to set the geometry of this app. There's no particular reason for it, I just think it looks better. I want to set the width to 600 and the height to 400. If I run this now, we have a slightly larger window, which means now we can work with the buttons. And let's start with the most basic button. This one we have already seen. Let me just create it again. I want to have a button, and this I get with ttk.button. Once again, we need a master, and this is going to be the window. Now, I have used this named argument here quite a bit, and you don't actually have to use that. Instead, what you can do is just pass in window or whatever master you want to have for this widget as the first argument in here. The first argument is always going to be the master. That way, you don't have to write so much. Besides that, for the button, you need some text for the name of the button. Let's say a simple button. Finally, we have to pack the button so we can see it. And there we go. We have a simple button that we can click on. Although right now, since the button doesn't have any function attached to it, it doesn't do anything. That we can change quite easily. And let me put the function right below the button so I keep everything organized. I want to create a function. Let's call it button function. In here, we don't have any parameters, and I just want to print a basic button. This I now have to attach to this button via the command. So in here, I want to pass in the function. If I run the entire thing now, I can click on the button and we can see a basic button. Besides that, instead of using a proper function here, you could also use a lambda function, like so. So lambda and print, and we have a basic button. Running this again, once again, I can click on the button and we get the same result. Once again, if you don't understand lambda functions, definitely check out a dedicated video for it. It's really important to understand for GUIs. I am going to use it quite a bit. You might be wondering, what if you have a function? Let me return to button function. What if you have a function with parameters? How could you incorporate that? Because when we are calling the function here, we can't call this function, so we couldn't pass in arguments. If you understand how functions work, this should be quite easy. I'm going to cover this in the next section in a bit more detail. For now, just think about it and maybe you can figure it out already. It's not that difficult. But, well, this is all we need for the basic button. We have seen all of this already, so there shouldn't be anything new so far. Although there's one more thing that we can do, and that is the button can also have a text variable. Let me create one as a separate variable. I once again want to have a tk and a string var. Don't forget to call it, and I want to assign it, let's call it button string. And this we can pass in here for the button string. If I run the entire thing now, we have an empty button. The reason for that is that this button string is now overwriting the text. And since there's nothing inside of the string var, we have a button without any text. So it looks like it's just a basic button. That we can change by setting a basic value for the string var. I'm going to call this one a button with string var. And let me fix the typo. There we go. If I run this now, we have a button with string var. And this is basically all you need for a basic button. It really doesn't do that much more. Later on, when we talk about layouts and styling, there's going to be a bit more, but for the basic button, this is pretty much all you are ever going to need. So with that, we can come to the next kind of button, and that is a check button. This one, let me create a basic check button. I'm going to call it check. This one we create with ttk and check button. In here, as always, we're going to need the master, which in my case is always the window. Then we have the text. Like the normal button, I want to call this one checkbox 1. And that is all we need for now. So let me pack this checkbox and see what we get. There we have checkbox 1, and in here I have a checkbox. I can click and unclick this. Also, I click this quite fast away. If I restart this, by default we have this other kind of value, which is, I guess, neutral. Besides that, we have on and off. But once we click on it, we can't go back to the neutral position. Another argument you can pass in here is command. And this works like in the normal button, meaning you could just add any kind of function you want. In my case, I'm going to go with lambda and just print check button. This function is going to be run every time we are pressing on this check button. Let me run this again. And now anytime I am clicking on the checkbox, we get check button, which is pretty useful. And now you might be wondering, how could we get the value? Or in other words, how do we know if this check button is on or off? We couldn't do something like check.get. If I run this and click on the checkbox, we get the check button object has no attribute get. Quite unfortunate, so we couldn't use that one. Let me undo all of this. And I just want to print the word check button. To store and check the value of check, we need a tkinter variable. Let me add it here. I want to have a check var. The value here is actually quite open-ended. We could, for example, use a tk string var, the one we have already seen. And this we now have to connect to this checkbox, and that we do. I guess I could put all of this over multiple lines, so it's a bit easier to read, like so. A checkbox doesn't have a text variable. Instead, we have just a variable. And this is going to work the same. So in here, I want to add my check var. The reason why it's not called text variable is because this variable doesn't set the text of this checkbox. Instead, the check var is going to store the value if this box is ticked or not. And that I can now check. So whenever I'm clicking on this box, I want to get my check var, and now I can use get. If I run the app now, you can see we already have one difference. And that difference is that this box right now is not neutral anymore. Instead, it is empty or unticked. And if I click on it, we get 1 or we get 0. And those values, since we can only store string vars, is going to be a string. I guess I can demonstrate this. The value we get returned, I want to put inside of type. And if I run this again, click on the checkbox, we're getting a string returned. It only looks like we get zeros and ones, but we are storing them inside of a string variable, so they're being converted to a string. Although that doesn't have to be, because we could, instead of a string var, use an int var. The result is going to be the same. If I run this thing now and click on checkbox, we still get zeros and ones. However, now, if I use type on what we're getting returned, once again, what we're storing now are integer values. And that should illustrate quite well that we are working with different data types. We have an int var for the tkinter variable, and we have a string var. While those two are different, the most basic thing you have to understand is that we're just storing basic data types of Python inside of slightly more complicated containers. That's all that's happening here. You could also add in here a Boolean var, and if I run this, we have the same result, except now we're getting Boolean values. And this might be the data type that makes the most sense here. So if I run the same thing again, we're getting true or false, depending if this thing is ticked or not. And this is why it is really important to understand tkinter variables to work with buttons. For the check button, if you want to check the value, you basically always need a tkinter variable. For simplicity, for this one, I want to keep on working with an integer variable. This one, let me run this again, we're always getting ones or 0. Although we could change that, because inside of this we have what is called an on value and we have an off value. And those, well, I think they're quite self-explanatory. On value is the value that's being returned when this value is turned on or when the box is checked. This, in our case, should be a number because we are working with integer for the storage. Let's say the on value could be 10 and the off value could be 5. If I now run the entire thing again, I can click on the checkbox and we get 10 and 5 depending if it's on or off, or checked or unchecked. And if you want to change the start value, you would have to work inside of the int var. So in here, if I set value to 10 and run the entire thing again, now the box by default is checked. Cool, so this is working quite well. Which means now we can work on the third kind of button, and that is going to be a radio button. Or rather, radio buttons, because you basically always want to use multiple. I want to start by creating radio 1, and this we get with ttk.radiobutton. For this, once again, we need a master, which is going to be the window, and then we need text, and this I want to call radio button 1. Since I do want to have 2 radio buttons, I'm going to duplicate this and change the 1 to a 2, both for the name and for the variable. And now I just want to pack radio 1 and radio 2 so we can actually see them, like so. And if I run the entire thing now, we have 2 radio buttons. But now you can see something weird. Let me restart the entire thing so I can explain what I'm doing. Right now, both radio button 1 and radio button 2 are unchecked. But if I click on either of them, all of a sudden, both are being ticked. So something weird is happening here. The super important thing you have to understand about radio buttons is that each of the widgets has to have a value. That is going to be just another named arguments. So in here, we have a value. The value here could be basically anything. Let's say for the first button, I want to have radio 1. And for the other button, I want to have the integer 2. Now if I run this again, I can click on each button and they don't trigger together anymore. If you don't set a value, the default value is going to be 0. And if you have the same default value for every single radio button, tkinter gets a bit confused. You basically always have to set a custom value here. Now, other than that, you can use this radio button like the buttons we have seen already. Which means you could also add a command like so. And this, once again, could be just a function or a lambda function. Let me go with lambda because all I want to do is print something. And the something I want to print is the value of this radio 1. And once again, I want to put all of this over multiple lines so things are a tiny bit easier to read, like so. We once again have the problem that we couldn't use radio1.get. If I run this and click on radio button 1, we get that the radio button object has no attribute get. Instead, what we have to do is kind of the same thing we have done for the check variable. We, once again, have to create another, let me call this one a radio var. We have to create a tkinter variable. And for this one, we have a bit of a problem because the value for this one is a string and the value for this one, radio button 2, is an integer. The best way for that, I find, is to use a string var. And this one is going to convert any kind of integer into a string, and that way you can work with it. And this you have to set as the variable for this radio 1 button, so radio var. There we go. And now you can use the radio var and get the value. Meaning if I print the entire thing and I click on radio button 1, we get radio 1. That is the value we specified in here for the value. So far, we basically have a check button. What makes radio buttons different is that the idea is you have this tkinter variable in multiple radio buttons. Let me add it for this button here, radio button 2. I want to have a variable as well, and this is going to be the same radio variable. Which means that this radio button and this radio button are both connected to this radio var here. which by default isn't particularly useful. If I run the entire thing again, I can click on 1, and we always get radio 1. Where this system becomes really useful is when I get the radio var from somewhere else. Let's say all the way in this button function. I want to print radio var and get the value. If I now run the entire thing again, I can click on radio button 1 and click on the button, we get radio var again, and if I click on radio button 2, we get 2, or the value inside of radio button 2. And the really important thing here is if I reorganize everything a tiny bit, the basic idea of a radio button is that only one button is ever activated. Meaning we could have multiple buttons and only one of them would ever be true. And then the value is going to be stored inside of this tkinter variable, and we could get it, for example, with a button. A checkbox is different to that, because inside of a checkbox, you can have multiple values that are ticked or unticked, whereas for a radio button, only one value is ever ticked. I can actually demonstrate this as well. If I wanted to create a second checkbox, let me create one right below. I want to have check 2, and let me be consistent with the naming here. This check should be a 1 and a 1 here. Check 2 is going to be another TTK check button. The master is going to be the window. The text is going to be checkbox 2. And let's say for the command, I want to have another lambda function that for now is just going to print test. And all of this I also have to pack. So check2.pack. If I run this again now, for the checkbox, we can have multiple values, and each of those are essentially self-contained. Whereas for the radio button, we only have one value ticked. This is quite different. Although that being said, if you really wanted to, you could connect those two check buttons quite easily using the check var. For example, if I click on check var, instead of printing something, I could also get check var and then set the value to the off value. Let's say a 5. This would be 5 in this case. I can now run this, and right now checkbox 1 is ticked, but if I click on checkbox 2, checkbox 1 is not ticked anymore. And I can retick it and click on checkbox 2, checkbox 1 will always be false. That way, you can connect these two buttons if you want to, but by default, they are not connected. Whereas for radio buttons, they are always connected. Although the connection here happens via the tkinter variable. And in here, sometimes you can get into minor problems. For example, if I set the value to 1 for both of them and run the entire thing again, if I now click on one of them, both are going to be ticked because they both have the same value. What basically happens is tkinter checks what is inside of the string variable. Right now, this could be a 1, and then it checks if this value is identical to the value inside of each widget. If it is, it's going to check this radio button. If it is not going to check it. So if these values aren't unique, you are going to have some slightly weird behavior, something you do want to keep in mind. But other than that, this is kind of all you need for the radio buttons. So with that, we have radio buttons, we have check buttons, and we have the basic buttons. With that, I want to do an exercise, and then we are done. And the exercise here is going to be a tiny bit more extensive. Let me copy and paste it in. It's going to look like so. I want you guys to create another check button and 2 radio buttons, and they are going to be very connected. For the radio button, each radio button should have the value A or B. If you click on either of the radio button, you are printing the value of the check button, the one you're going to create in a second. And also, if you tick either radio button, you're also unchecking the radio button. So as soon as you click on the radio button, you get the value of the checkbox and you uncheck the checkbox. And then for the check button, if you tick the check button, you print the currently selected value for the radio value. Also, you want to use a tkinter boolean value for the check button. Try to implement all of this yourself and see how far you get. First of all, I want to create the radius, and let me call this exercise radius so it's a bit easier to read. Now, in here, I want to have exercise radio 1 and I want to have exercise radio 2. Both of those are going to be created in basically the same way. I want to have TTK and radio button. The master, as always, is going to be the window. Then we have text. And in here, let me call them radio. And this is going to be radio A and radio B. That way, we have a bit of an indication if we're working with A or B. To actually get that value, we have to set, well, the value. And this one is going to be either A or it is going to be B. To store this value, we need a tkinter variable. Let me call this the radio string. And this one is going to be tk string var. I'm going to use string var because A and B are both going to be strings. If they were 0 or true or false, this would be a different kind of tkinter variable. Although string var is the one you're probably going to use the most. Besides that, I want to create a function that we can work with. And this, let me call it radio function. In here, no parameters. And basically what I want to do, when I'm clicking on either of these, I first of all want to set a command. So I'm connecting them with the radio function, like so. When I'm calling this function, either I want to get the current value of the check button, and I also want to untick the current check button. The problem we have right now is we don't have a check button, so we have to create that one first. I want to create an exercise check, and this is going to be TTK and check button. In here we need a window. The text is going to be the exercise check, and this one is also going to need a variable. And this one is going to need an on and an off value. And we don't have to set an on or an off value because 0 and 1 is perfectly fine here. And there's one thing I did forget, because we are not placing anything on the window right now, which I can do with exercise radio 1.pack, then exercise radio 2.pack, and then the exercise check.pack. And that is some atrocious spelling. Before I'm running this, I want to add pass inside of the radio function, so we're not getting an error. Running this now, we can see we have a few more things. So something is definitely working. We now just have to give it some proper functionality. And the first thing we are going to need now is to actually add tkinter variables so we can work with all of this. The exercise radio already has a string variable, although I didn't connect it to it. This we can do all the way at the end. We need a variable, and the variable is going to be the radio string, the one we created here. And let me put the entire thing like so. We have our data, we have the widgets, and we have the layout. I think that system makes the most sense. Besides the radio string, I also want to have a check, and this is going to be a Boolean value, because remember, in the exercise, we want to use a tkinter variable for Booleans. Which means in here, I want to have tk and Boolean var. This Boolean var, I now want to place inside of my exercise check. And here I need a variable, and this is going to be the check Boolean variable. With that, I can access the value inside of my radios and inside of my check buttons. Which means I can finally work on the radio function. In here, I want to get the value of the check button that is currently selected. And I'm just going to print it, so we're going to keep things simple. I want to get my check bool, and I want to get the value. And that is all I need for that part. If I now run the entire thing again, and I click either on radio A or on radio B, we are getting false. And that seems correct because the exercise check is not checked right now. If I do check it and click on either radio A or B, we're getting true. So this is looking pretty good. Next up, I want to set the value of the check button to false. That way it's not going to be checked. This I do with check bool and set. And in here, I want to pass in false. If I run this again now, I can click on the exercise check, and if I click either on radio A or B, it is going to be unchecked. So that is going to cover the first part of the exercise. For the next part, we have to work on the check button. And we only really have one bit left, and that is that ticking the check button prints the value of the radio button value. That is going to be so simple. We can do all of this inside of a lambda function. So in here, I want to have lambda. And this is going to print the radio string, and I want to get the value. The last thing I need is this should be command. And this is going to be very hard to read. Let me put all of this over multiple lines, like so. I assume you have a much wider monitor than I do, so you probably don't have to do this. But in my case, I want this to be visible on even smaller monitors, so I'm a bit more constrained. There we go. This is a bit easier to read. We have our exercise radio 1, radio 2, and the check. And the check now has a lambda function that prints the current value of the radio buttons. So I can run the entire thing. And now if I click on, let's say, radio A, I have the exercise check, and I can do this for B, and we get B. This is working pretty well. And with that, we have the different kinds of button, at least the basic ones that you can work with in tkinter. On top of that, I think you have a pretty good understanding at this point about tkinter variables. I am going to keep on using them quite a bit, so definitely make sure that you have at least a basic idea about how they work.